Hey everyone, I'm Clive,
Hey, and I'm Louie.
and today we're going to go through the secret to reducing your coordination issues by 53%. The agenda will be the root cause of bad BIM, talking about why we get such poor quality BIM sometimes. Then we'll talk about the opportunity that a BIM team had to discover the benefits of doing BIM and using a process in the right way. Then we'll talk about how it was actually deployed on a project to understand how those benefits that we've seen in this lab test actually come to fruition. So it's a pretty exciting, and it's a bit of an origin story for us as well. The spoiler alert is that it's not just about the tools. So BIM is actually more about process, and we talk about people, process, tools, but today we're going to talk mostly about the process. So that's the spoiler for what we're going to get into and what we're going to dig into. Should we talk about the root cause of bad BIM? That sounds interesting.
I think that's a good place for us to start.
Let's do it. So in 2014-15, we had a chance, and actually we presented as part of a team at Autodesk University. And one of the parts of that introduction was about BIM version 1.0, where we started by building 3D models, and they were perfect, great 3D models. But version 2.0 was where we were putting these models together and finding issues, finding problems with them. And then more and more people use BIM, and there's more and more uses for BIM. And we come into this 3.0, this era of an operational production system, and the era where there are so many other uses that there has to be a mindful planning process in order to be able to actually get the benefits that people are looking for. So this 1, 2, 3, this evolution was a kind of a cool journey, looks good, sounds good,
Yeah, version 1 was a really great start because it started more of giving a client or someone who can't visually see from a contract or a 2D document what that building might look like when it's actually built. 2.0 was to find it more useful and more collaborative in a sense that we could probably find more issues. And then 3.0 is where we're getting into all of the metadata, finding a lot of the use for procurement and budgeting and estimating purposes. And so this has been a great evolution over time.
But what's happening today? So if we look
Exactly.
at how all of that has changed and that good story, it sounds like a great story. Unfortunately, what's happening today is we're still experiencing thousands of issues, clashes, challenges, and mostly a reactive coordination process. And if you look at all of the BIM uses, the first one, the most common, is coordination. It's simple because we create models, we create them in a vacuum, we put them together, we find out where things are in the same place, and we fix them. And it's a great way of doing that in 3D. You can semi-automate it, and it makes it easier to create a list of issues. So we end up with more issues than we used to have. And that's why this 2.0 is still something that we need to look at. This is generally the workflow that we're following. Louis, you've been involved in teams that have done this day in, day out for months and years on end. What does that look like?
Typically, we model, then we combine these every week or every 2 weeks, and then we go through these coordination meetings and we update. We go back to our offices, or maybe we did it online, and then we update. And then we do this cycle for a month, 2 months, 3 months, depends on how long it might take sometimes to really get a good quality, clash-free model. And that's been something we've continued to do since we've been able to have these tools available to us, but yet we're still modeling with mistakes. Today we still model, and we actually plan for these mistakes.
In all other aspects of our lives, when we ask ourselves that question, what should we do when we make a mistake? Should we make
Learn
that
from it.
mistake time and time again?
No, we definitely should not. We should learn from that.
Great technology to create the models, great technology to combine them, and great technology to list out all of the challenges, the problems in them. And we keep doing that. We keep coming up with lists of thousands of clashes and problems. We wanted to look at what the root cause was. And a few years ago, we got the opportunity to say, why is this? And the root cause, if we unpack it with the 5 whys, in the most simple form, we have two objects trying to occupy the same space. And that's what flags as a clash. That's what flags as a problem. And this is usually because the models were uploaded at the same time, because the contract tells me to, because I am told on a monthly basis, weekly basis, daily basis, however that goes, I'm uploading my documents, my 3D models. And the reason why is because we operate in a traditional phase-based workflow. And we tend to create large batches of work. So we said, what would the solution be? How about we plan and agree on smaller batches of work and enable people to agree on a specific scope, and then also the interrelationship between teams to agree a sequence of that work that makes sense from a priority structure. And we said, this sounds like an opportunity. Don't you think, Louis? This kind of sounds pretty cool to be able to give this a shot.
Yeah, definitely. I've always had some ideas that we can improve, but never had the opportunity to actually run them.
The second part that we wanted to talk to you about was the opportunity. And it doesn't happen that often. I was very fortunate to have an opportunity where we could get teams from the owner, architect, engineer, contractor, all in one room, actually in a basement, for a protracted period of time, be able to understand the sequence of events and understand processes and understand best practices and cross-company understanding of what's important to each one of them. And at the time, I remember speaking, I went back to my wife, Laura, and I said, this is the most unique opportunity in the BIM world. And I thought that was like incredible. I thought it was like, a very big statement at the time. And I thought that she might say to me, that's great, Clive, that's fantastic. I'm so pleased with you having this opportunity. But instead she said, Clive, you know that you can't say most unique, all in one. You can, it by definition is unique. You're not having the most unique. So anyway, it was an interesting experience. And Louis, I don't know whether you remember some of this, but creating a lot of these best practices and processes.
Yeah, and we didn't just sit in a basement and do this. We communicated with all of the consultants. So like we had the architects, the engineers, the contractor, the owner, everybody was in the room, but we went out to the consultants. We went out and discussed with the designers, the project managers, the architects, subcontractors, just how this process could be efficient. How can, if you had this opportunity, how could you improve it? And everybody joined and gathered their feedback, and we would go back to this basement and put all of our notes and feedback together, and we built these processes and best practices. We even built the most optimal workflow timeline for a project, and
that was actually key. It was for a project, not for the design team, or not for the contractor, not for the owner. It was the good of the project, and that was kind of a key experience in understanding, always making a decision for the project. But looking at this, is this something that people can understand?
Probably not without guidance.
So what does this mean in simple terms? Let's take a look. The first thing we discovered, and it sounds simple now, even looking back at it, but priority matters. So when you look at a building and all of the objects, all of the elements, all of the systems, all of the components in that building, it really matters the sequence in which you build it virtually, because as we know, it's built in a certain sequence on site as well. And if you don't follow a priority structure, and fixing things that don't take priority earlier will cause more issues, more rework, and more pain for that project team. So priority is a really big deal. Don't you agree, Louis?
Yeah, if I was part of the mechanical and I was doing the mechanical systems, I knew who to talk to about, moving an object, or if pressurized systems were more flexible or less flexible, then I should communicate some of that with them. So I had some kind of guidance to coordinate these myself and not wait for a coordination meeting to resolve this.
this really is setting the scene. It's not saying specifically you must, in all project cases, model in this sequence. It's really an indication of what should be useful so that teams can understand the concept. And then on each project, you're going to need to have a priority structure set for that project, and not even, overall, it's per stage. So per time you create a model, what the purpose is, there's a set of elements. And if you sequence those elements correctly inside of that stage, then you really stand to benefit as a team. So this concept of priorities, how can you prioritize very easily if you stay at a 3, 4, 5 major phases in a project? It's very difficult to then prioritize because you've got so much work. It's unmanageable. So what we found was, if we broke the project, and actually breaking it down into, at that point in time, it was 17 different stages, 17 different stages. It really allows you to have a more focused group, and that focus allows you to prioritize within that stage and then also get the benefit by closing out that loop. So the smaller batches help teams to manage the work. The milestones that we defined, we could start the right teams at the right stage and understand the sequence inside of that stage so that the output from that stage, the deliverable, had less issues. And our hypothesis in very simple terms was, if everyone on the project knows and agrees to what they are responsible for and delivers it at the optimum time, things will be better for the project. Kind of simple.
Right.
And we said, how can we test this? How can we actually have a look and test this? And unlike kind of what happens in our industry generally, we don't get the opportunity to put teams from 10 different trades and the owner and the architect contractor all in the same room, and actually 2 teams. And this was a lab exercise that we ran. Both teams had the opportunity to have each of the exercises. And maybe, Louis, do you want to talk about the exercises, the 2 exercises?
Yeah, absolutely. In both exercises, we gave them 80 minutes. These 2 teams ran the same exercise. So in the first exercise, we followed a traditional phase plan, where they had 10 minutes to plan, 60 minutes to model, and then 10 minutes to fix as many clashes that they've created. What we noticed right away is they actually didn't even spend that much time planning. They kind of got their design. They knew what they went to do. They stuck their head in their computer and just ran with it. And then they spent time trying to clash and fix them, but ended up with a amount of clashes.
This was interesting because us as an industry, if I wear the plumber's hat or the architect's hat or the mechanical contractor's hat, I know what my scope is. I know, and therefore I can just go. As soon as I know what the project type is and I get some input from certain people, and most of the time I'm saying, I'm bugging people, can you give me this? What they can do is get on with it and then start creating. And that's the powerful part of our industry, because there's so much experience in the industry.
Yeah, and I think one thing I forgot to mention is we did involve every trade. So we had one person from every trade that had experience to model. They came in, we provided them the same architectural design, and they built their own trades, their systems, and elements, a list of elements that they were supposed to do. However, in exercise 2, what we said was, instead of 10 minutes planning, spend 20 minutes planning. But we gave them 6 columns, and that represented stages. And we said, use those same lists and just prioritize them. And after every stage, we're going to synchronize our models and quickly review them before the next stage. The teams right away got up out of their chairs and went to the board and started pool planning backwards based off of their task. And we didn't even tell them, guide them or anything like that. We just gave them the board, and they kind of just started to do that.
Instead of them taking what they know their scope is and going off and starting, they had conversations with each other. And they said, well, I'm not going to start even modeling my lights until you've set the ceilings, because I know that I want to put my lights in that place. Or, well, we need to know the lights for the layout. So the architect early on maybe has to put just a symbol representing where that is going to be, because obviously there's an impact on other things. So there's a series of conversations that occur that don't naturally occur inside of our traditional phase-based approach.
Yep.
It's
And, so, and it was pretty easy. All we had to do is just say, hey, what is it that you need before you can actually model something, or to make the right decision for you? What is it that you need? And they started talking and discussing and prioritizing items themselves. We didn't even show them a priority structure. They kind of just said, hey, these are the items that are not as flexible. These are the items that are flexible. One of the observations or comparisons is they were talking while within those 10 minutes, they were talking throughout that 60-minute period that they were working. They just kept talking instead of it being a quiet room like it was in the previous exercise. So that was where we kind of said, hey, this is kind of working. Our hypothesis is headed in the right direction.
Understanding what the other teams are doing suddenly made what they were doing so much more powerful for the project and for all of those other team members. So there's this I give and I get, and there's exchanges of information that are required at different stages. And they had their conversations really early, set them out in that plan, and then they went about following it per stage. And the results were pretty amazing.
In exercise 1, their average issues were 235 issues, so clashes. These were elements that took up the same space, or just, wouldn't have been worked out. And this is just from the report of us clashing, using a tool to clash. And in exercise 2, there was only 63 issues. And, they still had the time to come in and reduce that number. It was the same 80-minute period. All they did was spend 20 minutes planning with a little bit of guidance, and just that was huge in their eyes. So this led us to the next chapter in our agenda, is how to get to 53% fewer clashes.
That said 73%.
Right, 73%.
Why can we only get 53?
The 73% was from the test. 53% was from actual real projects that we took this process and we implemented it inside of that process on 2 projects.
That's pretty good. I'd be happy with 3%. So our thesis on this project, as we went into it, was large batches cause information buildup. That buildup is the cause of issues. Misunderstandings are the root cause of that issue, usually, and the more focused stages with smaller batches would produce focused results and better results. So that was our kind of thesis going in. This was the real project, and following that process with a lean BIM scoping, sequencing, comparing it actually to a similar project. And this is another thing that just doesn't happen in our industry that often, very rarely at all. Yeah. We had 2 projects running at precisely the same time. They had teams from the same companies on board, and we could run that process on one project and directly compare against the other one. So it
felt like a competition at some point, because it was the same teams, two different teams, but the same companies working on it, and which they were part of the testing as well. But this really did feel like a competition, because they started roughly at the same time, and they were competing on their clashes at every one of these stages.
So how did they do that? So in real life, how did they do that? We saw the cards in the lab experiment and the results there. But in real life, we had to, first of all, understand the building blocks. So in a project, if you knock down any building, you end up with a set of elements, and those elements are the ones that we build in the 3D model. So it makes sense for us to have this library of building blocks that we would start with, and people would understand either they are a generic, and usually in this example, unless you are an owner that repeats the work, for example, like Starbucks or a company that always does pretty similar things, Amazon with a data center, you might have a series of objects that are repeating. But in a traditional process, or the rest of the world, you need a set of elements that are generic, maybe to start with, that can get swapped out later. But understanding what you're starting with is incredibly important. And then being able to have that clearer scope, not just that that element might be required, but does it need clearances? Does it need connection? Does it need additional information? Who is required at what point in time to put that in? And really going into that detail is incredibly important for that plan so that people can understand it. Then we looked at how do you have a multi-party agreement when this happens and we traditionally follow a very closed door environment. What we end up seeing is people have disagreements. So mutual agreement actually happens very often when you have two parties in the same place. So we had a lot of pool planning, and in this environment, we can't expect everyone to be in the same place, but using online tools and online methods to have that same and replicate that same process is very, very powerful to get that agreement as you have handoff of information, as you have handoff of responsibility for an element, for example, at the optimum time.
Yeah, one of the things I like to really I see being more successful is when you do involve every team to make that agreement, to make that plan. It becomes something more of their responsibility to do that because they said they would. When it's more mandated, or when it's something like a contract, here's this timeline, here's this, do that, there's like a negative or a step back reaction to it. So having them involved and feeling part of the plan, even if it might be, okay, this is what we did last project, what do you think we should do on this project? Just having them get engagement, they truly feel like it is something that we can do and build together.
And then making it visual was a very powerful thing, because understanding somebody else's scope is really difficult if it's just the word that they call it or the abbreviation that they use, because I don't speak that language every day. But seeing the element, seeing the object, we walk around buildings every single day. We see these objects in our ceilings, the exposed ceilings, that we haven't really known what they are or who's responsible for them, but now it's an object that we can see. So that visual nature was really, really powerful. And then being able to have teams sequence these activities so that inside of one stage, they can know exactly what the order is going to be and have notifications of when they should start their work, really allows people to be a lot more focused on what's important for the project and not create work that then needs to be reworked later. As a result, we end up with less issues. In the case we had, 98% of the constructability issues were actually solved as they went through. So it wasn't just the clashes, but it was also constructability issues.
We had project managers, architects, designers, engineers, not just the decision makers, but also the guys or gals that are actually doing the work and modeling and designing, the ones that are going to be in the project and should know, fully aware of how the timeline was built. So that really got everyone to really trust each other.
And in the end, not only did they have a lot less issues, but they saved 2 months on a 12-month design schedule, which was pretty cool. Clearer scope, smaller chunks of work, and an output that was quicker and better. You end up with happier teams because you're using more effective, more focused work and creating better outputs. So in conclusion, if everyone can agree in a collaborative way on what they need to do and why, for the good of the project, life will be good for everyone. But the problem that we have is that this is an extremely difficult task. This is so challenging for industries where you've been so used to being traditionally contracted and focused on your scope and getting output to get paid, versus having a more collaborative planning and a focus on the good of the project and eliminating waste. And we realize it's not just the tools, it's the process and the workflow. And the future we see for BIM is the combination of tools and processes that enable teams to have more optimum outcomes, less waste, more efficient processes. And we
and don't if you're trying to take on this task, don't feel overwhelmed. Don't think if you're someone who's trying to do this or implement this, don't feel like it is something that you can't do. What's that?
The comments coming in.
The comments come in.
So it can be a big challenge because there's so many standards and processes when it comes to BIM.
It is something that if you're doing on a project basis, it takes a lot of projects to come up with the right, like we said earlier, not everybody had the opportunity to run this test lab like we did and actually implement it. So
we decided to make it simple.
So we made it simple.
we didn't talk about software really the whole way through, but we've created a simple BIM management platform to make sure that following exactly that workflow is actually really simple, and enabling teams to define a good plan, a good scope, collaboratively agree on the schedule and the sequence for those tasks, track them, and then dropping in a model to verify that they're meeting those objectives at a milestone basis. So information delivery milestones, smaller batches of information, easier transfer, much more focused and much more efficient, better results. This is what we focused our lives on for the last X number of years.